Hello, AP World History. This video is going to go over the first chapter of our textbook, and it's essentially going to cover the origins of human civilization and the origins of the first humans. Okay, so some terms that you should be familiar with. I'm not going to go over them right now. I feel like that's a waste of time, and I'm thinking that most of these terms are pretty obvious to you. We're going to talk quite a bit about hominids in this chapter, and again, we'll spend quite a bit of time in class, but pay particular attention to hominids and, of course, the idea that it was not only the Homo sapiens that evolved in the earliest examples of human-like creatures, right? We also had the Neanderthal culture, which in many ways rivaled the present-day humans or Homo sapiens. All right, moving on. Okay, again, not going to spend too much time on this, but if you ever ask the question, how are we able to tell how old something is? There is radiocarbon dating. We'll talk about this more in class, but radiocarbon dating can be inaccurate. And so this causes some debate about the actual age of some of the earliest, not only human forms, but also other life forms. Okay, so let's talk about Lucy a little bit. So Lucy is mentioned explicitly in the text. There are some other images of her as, also a, sort of a scientific rendering of what she would have looked like. Okay, so Lucy is famous because she was the most intact hominid, or one of the most intact hominids that has ever been discovered. Also one of the oldest intact hominids that was ever discovered, right? So here you see her mostly intact skeleton here. She died approximately 3.2 million years ago, and the first hominids that were remains that were ever discovered were found approximately 4.4 million years ago, and there's debate that the oldest hominids could have appeared later or earlier, that is, as early as 5 million years ago. But nonetheless, Lucy is very significant. She was discovered near Addis Ababa, which is the present-day capital of Ghana. And just to sort of put things into perspective, if the earliest hominids were discovered approximately 4.4 million years ago, as we see here, but the modern Homo sapien, right, the modern human, developed approximately 200,000 years ago. So, a very long evolutionary period here. Okay, so again, 4.4 million years ago or so, first hominids, they were much smaller than present-day humans, right? There's no way to prove for sure, but most archaeological records and most studies indicate that that these early hominids were not permanent in terms of their living situation. They were nomadic in nature, so they had to travel around to find food. There's also there's no archaeological record that suggests that they used any tools to hunt or prepare their food or do anything else. So that also distinguishes them from the modern Homo sapiens, and also some of the more evolved human forms, such as the Neanderthals. Okay, just also some terms to throw around. I would say number 2 and number 3, definitely know these. Homo erectus, the idea of standing erect, standing upright, right? Person who walks upright. Homo sapiens, right? Capable of thought. Okay, so that's important for us to realize where those Latin terms come from, but those terms may be thrown around on the AP exam, so just know them. Know also that the climate was not static, was not stable in the early development of the Earth, right, or even the later development of the Earth, that is. The last known ice age occurred approximately 10,000 years ago, and this is when many archaeologists argue that the migration to North and South America began in this last ice age. Okay, so again, as I was referring to just a second ago, if you see migratory patterns, so here's, sort of sub-Saharan Africa, some of the earliest known hominids were discovered here, right? And then you see various migratory patterns, and notice that the latest, basically because they had the longest to travel, the latest place that was settled by hominids, actually basically fully evolved humans, right, Homo sapiens, because it was 10,000 years ago, these emerged much later than in Eurasia and Australia, right? Okay, so what distinguishes humans, modern day humans, from some of the earlier hominids? Many archaeologists argue that it is a development of culture, right? A way that they actually sort of interact socially with one another, developing language, starting to worship, preparing food in a variety of ways, diversifying labor. So that could mean gender diversification. So women, women and children being in control of gathering rather, and preparing food, whereas men in charge of hunting, right? You also have class distinctions develop as a form of culture. So the development of slavery, right? The distinction between rich and poor. You're going to see the introduction of sedentary or permanent civilizations. That's another really good indicator of, sort of a more civilized, or if you argue that that term is not politically correct, just a more sedentary form of living, right? Development of technology, huge. The development of tools, also huge. Okay, the Stone Age, of course, named after the medium with which they make tools, right? Stones. They are divided. We talk about the Paleolithic period in chapter 1 specifically. We also talk about the Neolithic period, and also the Neolithic period is significant because that's when the earliest forms of agriculture begin. All right, so again, I would pause it if you want to take a moment to actually read through and digest all of this, but just realize that prior to the modern Homo sapiens, we have earlier forms of hominids. The more important, I would argue, would be Homo erectus, right? Just because they are much, I guess, closer in an evolutionary sense to the modern day humans. Of course, they are very important because they stood upright, right? No previous hominids ever did this, and we also see more sophisticated forms of food preparation among the Homo erectus. All right, language development, approximately 50,000 years ago. Okay, this is a verbal language, by the way. Written language took much longer to develop, and we'll talk about that more in chapter 2. All right, so the first Homo sapiens, okay? So important for us to realize that that the modern human developed actually in multiple parts of the world at the same time, right? Okay, so the Neanderthal developed, well, arguably in Germany, because that was where the first Neanderthal remains were found. Okay, Neanderthals also they are different in an evolutionary and anatomical standpoint from modern humans, in the sense that they have larger heads, and also they arguably had less intellectual capacity than modern day humans as well. But we are getting much closer to the modern day human, right? Neanderthals also were much more sophisticated because they made tools. They also started to live in actual groups, social groups, right? You also saw that they did things such as bury their dead. They did practice very limited forms of surgery, right? They were able to clothe themselves and live in colder climates, okay? And of course, since previous hominids already were able to do things like make fire, that also allowed them to live in cold climates. Okay, so the Homo sapiens sapientis, right, or the Homo sapiens sapiens, right, they are the modern human. They are what we are, okay, and they originated approximately 50,000 years ago. The earliest form originated in Africa. So this is what's interesting. You have all these different hominids emerge throughout planet Earth concurrently, but nonetheless, the only surviving hominid, well, that's not true. The only surviving Homo sapien hominid, right? So a standing upright hominid that's capable of thought. So I'm not talking about orangutans and other hominids that still exist today, okay? But I'm talking about sort of these hominids that spoke languages and were able to trade and do more diverse things. They emerged concurrently, but what's going to eventually happen is that the Neanderthals are going to sort of get killed off by the more intelligent Homo sapiens, or the Cro-Magnons. All right, sorry, that was not particularly articulate there, but anyway, you get the idea. Okay, so Cro-Magnons, they again were seen as more sophisticated compared to Neanderthals. They had better weapons. They arguably had better language capacity compared to the Neanderthals, but nonetheless, there was evidence that they traded with Neanderthals, that they interbred with Neanderthals. But at the same time, Cro-Magnons arguably kind of did not necessarily explicitly kill off the Neanderthals, but nonetheless, basically by survival of the fittest, by natural selection, you're going to find that Cro-Magnons are going to edge out Neanderthals. And of course, nowadays, there is no such thing as a Neanderthal, despite what those Geico commercials may tell you. Anyway, sorry, that was a cheesy joke. Okay, again, Cro-Magnons, they display other forms of culture, like in the form of art, for example. Of course, you're probably very familiar with these early cave paintings that exist. We'll talk about these more in class, but what's interesting about cave paintings is that you could say that they show early forms of religion, because why would one paint in a cave? It's obscure, it's far away, it's not like it's in front of your house and you want to show off your wealth, right? So a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists argue that cave paintings actually were spiritual in function, right? That it was something that you put on a wall in order to hopefully conjure up, or hopefully worship in a way that would produce more food. Okay, but you also do have early forms of art, and there's one in the textbook that shows a female form with exaggerated sexual characteristics. So that also suggests that even the earliest humans were very interested in fertility, right? The Neolithic Revolution, again, we're going to talk about this much more in class because this is huge. All right, but what does this mean? Why is this so significant? Well, ultimately, it leads to the first sedentary societies, right? So just like when we talked about the agricultural revolution in Europe last year in AP Euro, we can talk about how the Neolithic Revolution was its own agricultural revolution in itself, right? What we're going to see is that people are now going to be able to plan for the next season, right? They're going to be able to develop a food surplus, for example. The population is going to start growing as a result. Again, you're going to have diversification of labor as a result of the agricultural revolution, gender diversification of labor, class diversification of labor. You're going to see early forms of slavery develop, okay? You're also going to see the developments of early cities. All right, so one of the earliest known cities is Jericho, right, in modern day, the West Bank, modern day Israel, right, and then also Ketal Hayuk, which is in present day Turkey. We'll look at maps of these, and there are maps of these in your text. Okay, so nonetheless, very, very significant, the agricultural revolution. We'll talk about this much more in class, but other things that made it significant, again, religion started to evolve, and religion was very tightly bound to the production of food, right? Or or hunting, for example, or fertility, right? Religion was tied to survival. All right. So eventually what you're going to have is, as populations grow, you're going to actually have permanent civilizations that become more sophisticated in nature. Okay, again, these emerge concurrently. So there are several early civilizations, early permanent civilizations that spring up in different parts of the world. The most well-known, or arguably the earliest one, was in the Fertile Crescent, right, present-day Iraq. Again, we'll talk about this much, much more. But here we are, and we can talk much more in class about why these different civilizations emerged concurrently. This is a pretty shabby map, but again, you can see the locations of these. All in very warm climates, as you notice. Okay, also economic development, right? This is also going to make a civilization become more complex. This is also going to lead to the development of written languages for the first time. When people trade, they need to have some sort of way to keep a written record of what they are trading. So that's one of the reasons why written languages develop when they do. More sophisticated ways of methods of agriculture, like irrigation systems, right? Okay, the development of art, metallurgy, right? Using copper first, also bronze, other metalworks to develop tools. Again, diversification of labor in the form of art and the development of artisans as a actual group of people who contribute to the economy. Okay, I'll just do one more short video to tack on to this one. Be right back.